It's one thing for me to tell you how to write a good introduction and the types of things I want to see in your introduction, like a little bit of background context, you flagging the scope of your response, clearly stating your arguments and clearly stating your conclusion. And it's one thing for me to tell you these things, but it's another thing for you to actually do it. And so what I've got here is a sample introduction, draft introduction from a student, and what we're going to do is talk through what they do well versus what they could still improve on. Right. So if we look at the first sentence here, the student opens, okay, with a general statement. Awesome. That sets the scene for their paper. That basically does what I kind of want in terms of easing you into the paper, setting the scene, providing that little bit of context. So the student is here flagging that foreseeability is a contested area of principle in contract law. Nothing wrong with that. But if we look at the student's next sentence, okay, which I'll just highlight here, okay, we start to run into a little bit of bother, a little bit of trouble. So the student has, we must look back to the fundamental principles of contract law to explore both sides of the argument of removing the element. The back part of their sentence here tells me that this is probably what the question is involving. Should the element or the principle be removed or retained? Which is fine in the sense of the student clearly showing that they're answering the question, but the first part of their sentence doesn't do much. It doesn't tell me much about the paper that's to come. Okay, all it says is we must look to the fundamental principles of contract law. It's not sufficiently specific, and in that sense, it's not setting the scene for the paper to come, okay? So what I would advise is that this student comes back to their introduction at the end of the paper to really hone down on what it is they're looking at and what the scope of their response is, and making sure that that clarity and that specificity is there even as early as the second sentence. Okay, so that sentence to me is not sufficiently specific. It doesn't tell me enough. Now, if we look at the next sentence, okay, if we look at the next sentence, we've got here the justification and fundamental values of contract law, which have developed, provide a frame in which to elucidate the importance of the foreseeability element in general law frustration claims. This seems to be their thesis, okay, that the foreseeability element is important. But if we look back to their previous sentence, they said that they were going to explore both sides of the argument. So in their previous sentence, to me, they're sitting on the fence when it comes to this particular question, but their next sentence says that the foreseeability element is important. So I see that as a little bit of an inconsistency in their introduction that would also need to be resolved. And in terms of resolving that, if they do look at both sides of the argument, I want to know how that informs their ultimate position that the foreseeability element is important and should be retained. So they just need to make those connections a little bit clearer between what they look at in their paper and what they argue and their ultimate conclusion of X. Okay. All right, so we move on to their final sentence. The foreseeability element should not be removed, okay? That gives us some indication of their conclusion. It should not be removed as it provides stability and measure to the ability to use frustration as a defense for breach of contract. Now, whilst this is good in the sense that we have a clear sense of their conclusion, which is one of those things that I think is important for an introduction, this here doesn't really tell us much about their arguments and how that argument actually informs the conclusion it shouldn't be removed. Okay, what do you mean by stability? What is this stability you talk of? What does that mean for, you know, is it risk allocation that the student is talking about? Is that because it somehow relates? I don't know. As in, like, it's just a little bit confusing how it pieces together and what is meant by stability. And in relation to the last thing, measure to the ability to use frustration as a defense, that I find a little bit curious just from a content perspective, because frustration isn't a defense to breach of contract. It's something that arises which causes the contract to be automatically terminated, like it automatically discharges future obligations. So it's not it's not a breach of contract, it's something different. So if this is going to be relevant to the student's argument, I 100% need to know how or why, okay? And maybe there's a link there to force majeure types of terms, but if so, I need it spelled out very clearly. All right, so if we think back on what the student does, they do give a general sense of the essay to come, but they're not giving us sufficient specificity. They're not telling us the key arguments that they're going to make, which lead to their ultimate conclusion that the element shouldn't be removed. And they're not explaining how those kind of steps in their argument work together. And also there's a little bit of clarity missing around how they use the content that explores both sides of the argument. So I really feel like for a first draft, this introduction's okay, but when the student finishes their paper, they really do need to come back once they have a little bit more clarity about what they argue and why, and then tidy up their introduction before they submit. All right, so that's Marie's top tips to getting your introduction from a first draft to something that is, going to put you in good stead for a submittable version of your paper.